Hi everyone, in today's video I'll be showing you how I made these two lovely outfits. Both dresses are corsets, and so we'll be starting with the strapless dress. A list of the items will be in the description box. First thing I did was to trace out my pattern. So I want to let you know that I do not always create my pattern from scratch once I have a basic bodice and a basic skirt for a particular person. Sometimes I can use two different clients' pattern to create a totally new pattern for another person instead of starting from scratch, especially if they have the same body measurement or similar body measurements. Right now what I'm doing is creating the cup at the under bust area, and I'm just freely sketching with my hand and using my curve ruler. There's no specific measurement on this, but all you have to do is just create a curve with your pencil and your curve ruler. I went ahead to print shrink my fabric. So after that I pinned my pattern to my fabric, traced round it, and then added all my necessary seam allowances. At the side I added about 1.5 inches, which is approximately 4 cm, but at the knee area I added just 1 inches, which is about 2.5 cm. After that I went ahead to trim off my pattern that I've traced out on my fabric. Don't forget to notch. So I notched the knee and the sides at the hip area. I repeated the same process for the other pieces of my pattern, that is tracing around the pattern for both the side seam and the center seam for the back pieces, and I cut them out. Now we'll cut out the same pattern that we just got for our satin. We'll cut it for our lining and our fabric. So for this end of the fabric or the lace, if you notice I pinned it. That is because this space is going to give you like a triangular shape, and you don't want that because the pattern, that the paper here, is rounded. And to do that is either you trim this off, that's this excess fabric you have, you trim it off and you use your gum to hold it back, or you just sew a dart on this area so that it's going to balance. Now I have all three pieces of my fabric cut out: my satin, my lining, and my lace fabric. The next thing I did was to use my UHU gum to glue my satin and my lace fabric together, but it is not compulsory you do this. However, if you decide to use a gum, just make sure you're not pressing hard on your gum. You're just slightly dabbing the gum. Once you place your lace on the satin, just slightly use your hand to push it to the side. I went ahead to repeat the same process for all the pieces of my lace and satin fabric. Once I was done, I went ahead to trim out all the excess fabric I have on my lace. Then this is what all my pieces look like at the moment. So you start sewing from the center back piece by joining your zip together, but I usually like starting from the knee, that's just above the knee area where I have my notch mark. So I like to sew that area upward and also sew it downwards towards the hem. But at the zipper area I like to use loose stitch. After joining my zipper allowance together, or my center back piece together, I went to press it with my iron. Then I'll be adding my side pieces together because the back piece is cut as a 3-piece skirt. So I just pinned it right now and I'm going to sew. But as usual, I'm going to start sewing from just where I have my notch mark at the knee. After sewing, I pressed it with iron to give it a smooth finish, and I snipped the knee area or above the knee area, but I also snipped some other areas on it. Now I am placing my front piece together and sewing it with my back piece, and I'm also going to press it with my iron. Then I'm going to set it aside so that I can begin tracing out the bodice part of the gown. So right now I'm just tracing out the bodice for the gown. I noticed the bra cup I'll be using for this gown is slightly bigger than the person's bust. So I'm just trying to expand the cup area a bit so that the bra cup can fit into the cup area. And remember, there's nothing new about this pattern. It's the same old pattern I've used before, but I'm just retracing out the lines using my tracing wheel and my pencil to highlight the line just so that it can be visible. So I'm cutting out the pattern now. And please, I want to advise, when you want to cut out your pattern, you should label it, because sometimes it can be a bit confusing after you've cut this out. Then another reason why we're just like tracing out this pattern on another sheet of paper is so that we have a reference, because you don't want a situation whereby you finish sewing your pattern, there's an error and you don't even know where the error came from. So I always like to retrace my pattern on another paper and keep the original just for reference purpose. That way, I don't have to create patterns from scratch all the time. At the two ends of the cup, I marked 4 cm, but at the middle, I marked 6 cm. Then I connected the lines. After connecting, I went ahead to trim, as you can see. So now I have all my pieces together. Once I was done, I went ahead to trace out my back pattern. I like to keep my pattern for reference purpose, so I'm doing the same thing again like I did with the front, just to have duplicates of what I am sewing. At the center back, I measured 1 inch, which is approximately 2.5 cm below the armhole line. Then I connected it to the armhole using a curve ruler. Then at the back arc, I measured 3 cm inward. Then I connected with a line. At the tip of my dart, I measured 1.5 cm to the left and to the right. Then I connected it to the dart leg. This is just to help us smash the waist. After I finish connecting it, I'm just labeling just for you guys to see. And so I'm folding my dart leg and blending my lines or throwing my lines using my ruler and with the help of my tracing wheel. So now we're going to cut out this back pattern and we are ready to place it on our fabric and start sewing. So after cutting, I'm just going to tape that area down so that it doesn't move. So now I'm just placing my pattern on top my fabric that has my stay or fusible interfacing, and I'm cutting it out. But on the cup area, I decided to add some piece of wadding, so I ironed wadding to it and I'm ready to sew. So this is just me joining the pieces of my cutout pattern or cutout fabric together to create the cup, and I am pressing with iron. As soon as I finished ironing, I trimmed off the excess seam allowances that I no longer need. I ironed fusible interfacing just to hold the seam down. So I'm using a mixture of both Regline boning and plastic boning. I snipped around the edges where the cup will sit so that it's easy for me to sew in the cup. So I'm just sewing in the cup, and once I was done, I went ahead to start sewing in my boning for the Regline boning, and I used the same allowance for the bodice to create my casing. So I'm just rolling multiple lines for the back pattern, and so around the center back area I sewed 2 lines of bias tape to serve as a bone channel for my bone. I joined my front piece and back piece together with loose stitch. After that, I went ahead to insert my bone in the areas that need to be inserted. Then I kept it aside and started preparing the loop. I folded the fabric into half and I measured about 4 cm. Then I cut the strip of fabric out and went ahead to sew it. So you want to make sure that when you're sewing, the beginning part should just be slightly wider to give you like a Y shape while you thin out or thin in the rest of the fabric. So after sewing the fabric, I decided to turn it inside out just to give it a form of neat finish. But you don't really have to do this. You can just do whatever works for you or whatever method you think is easier for you. After trimming out the excess, I went with my needle and thread and tacked one side of the loop about 3 times. Then I inserted the needle into the loop or into the channel that I just saw. Then I am going to turn it inside out by pulling on the needle so that the loop can be neat and you won't be able to see the stitch mark outside. After turning it inside out, I pressed it with iron. Then I marked 5 cm as the length of each loop. After sewing the first loop, I went ahead to cut another one. But now I'm going to sew the second one beginning from the middle point of the first loop that I have installed. Then from that middle point, you can mark 3 cm or 3.5 or 4 cm. But I know I marked about 3.5 cm. You will repeat this process until all the loops are attached. After attaching all my loops, I went ahead to attach the bodice to the skirt. Please use gathered stitch or loose stitch at the side of the corset seam because you will loosen it. Since the bra cup that I'm using is not padded and it's bigger than my client's bust, I decided to pad it so that it would give a form of push-up effect. There are different ways to do this. You can do it with Estee, you can do it with polyfill. You just choose whatever method you feel is easier for you. However, for this project, I used polyfill and created an enclosure for the polyfill. So the first thing you want to do is mark at least 1 cm before the bust or just at the bust point, and you connect to the side. Then you create like an enclosure just to give the same shape of a bust. Once you've created that enclosure, you sew around it and you fill that enclosure with your polyfill. Then you're going to use your needle and thread to sew or attach your new enclosure to your bra cup. That way it's going to give a push-up effect. After sewing the bra insert, I folded the cup in half to get the midpoint. Then I used my sewing machine to attach that midpoint area to my corset cup area. Then I located the nipple or bust point. Then I used a needle and thread to tack it in so that it doesn't move. Once I was done, I used an iridescent fabric. The next thing I did was to create gathers on my iridescent fabric by using loose stitch or gathered stitch just to give the fabric a bit of volume. So this is me drawing the gathers, and as soon as I got a bit of volume, I loosened the side seam and I placed the fabric on top my outfit. So you just want to gently create pleats to the best of your ability. There's no standpoint rule for this. Sometimes when doing this, you have to unpin, repin, rearrange, and just keep turning your fabric from left to right until you get what you want. I kept pleating the fabric, especially at the underbust, until I was satisfied with the result. As soon as I loved the outcome, I trimmed off the excess fabric at the side. Then I used my pins to hold the areas down that I couldn't really hold down because of the bulk of the fabric. Then I went to my sewing machine and decided to edge stitch those areas. After edge stitching, I went ahead with my needle and thread and I started hand tacking. And just know that you are going to hand tack the whole of the areas that you pleated on. So take your time. It took me about 3 hours and 45 minutes to do this. After hand tacking or hand stitching, I went with my iron to press the fabric so that the pleats can lay flat. Then I trimmed off the excess fabric at the side seam. The next thing I did was to resew my side seam area. That's to join the back and the front together at the side. After that, I went ahead to attach my zipper. After attaching my zipper to the back of the gown, just make sure your lining pieces is slightly bigger than your actual lace fabric. If, for instance, the seam allowance left on your lace dress is 4 cm, on your lining, what should be left should be about 3 cm or 3.2 cm. Now I'm placing my fabric and my lining right side to right side, and I'm pinning by making sure that all my notches meet. Then I'm going to put hemming gum or fusible interfacing at the top part of the dress. The next thing I did was to measure the width of the back so that I'll know how wide my modesty panel should be. I placed the center back pattern on a fabric that was folded in half. Then I added the seam allowance just so that the modesty panel can have similar shape. Please make sure to sew all areas of the modesty panel except the center back area. After sewing, trim off the excess fabric, then snip the edges so that it can be pointed. After doing that, turn the fabric inside out, then press with your iron. Now we're ready to attach the modesty panel to the back of our gown. Pin the modesty panel beginning away from your seam allowance at the top and at the bottom. Then put your lining on top the modesty panel. So your modesty panel should be in between your fabric and your lining. Then we are also going to pin fusible interfacing or hemming gum round the top of our fabric and at the modesty panel area. Then we are going to sew and press with our iron. Since our lining is bigger than our fabric, you should create tiny pleats. So make sure your modesty panel is exactly at the end of your seam allowance. Try and arrange it as close as possible. Then you sew a straight line from the top to the bottom at the center back. After stitching, I went ahead to iron the fabric. So I'm just placing the lining on top to just serve as a protective sheet while ironing. So to turn the back of your corset, as you can see here is rough. This is my center back area. So I'm going to put my center back right side to right side facing the skirt. Then I'm going to take my lining for my skirt and put it on top my center back bodice and my skirt. So in the middle I have my center back bodice, but at the two ends, that's up and down, I have my skirt. This is my skirt lining, this is my actual skirt fabric. So it's going to be like this. So now I'm going to go to my sewing machine and stitch like this. You can remove the teeth of your zipper so that it doesn't break your needle and so that it allows you to stitch across the zipper. Or you can skip the teeth of the zipper, then you use a needle and thread to sew across the teeth. After sewing, I trimmed off the excess zip that was left. Right now, this is what the corset is looking like. It looks neat and we are almost done. The next thing I did was to put the lining and the lace fabric right side to right side, and I stitched on my zipper allowance. So you want to stitch to the best of your ability, but if you can stitch on the exact line, it's going to make it really look neat. After stitching, I pressed it with iron again, and this is what the dress is looking like. Now we're going to finish up the bottom of the dress. So remember when I said you have to trim the hem so that it doesn't give you like a triangle shape? This is what I am doing right now. So I'm just marking out where I need to trim. Then I will attach the scallop edge to the hem of the fabric with the help of my glue. After finishing the edges for the front, now I am going to do the back. So I'm just slightly losing all the seams at the hem to enable me finish up the satin edges properly. So it's either you serge the hem of your satin fabric, because if you notice I did not glue the edge of the fabric, so it's either you serge the edge of your satin fabric or you just fold it and stitch on top it. Now I'm measuring the hem of my dress. That's, I want to know the width so that I can know the length of fabric for the scallop I need to glue on it. So I'm just trimming out the scallop edges of the lace. After trimming, this is what it looks like. So now I'm going to glue it to the hem of the dress. Just make sure that you stitch all the areas of the hem that you have loosened, except for the center back hem. You want to leave that open. So this is my front fabric, this one that has the boning, while this is my lining. So I'm just going to put the front fabric together at the waistline, lining and fabric, and I'm going to stitch just to hold the waist together so that my dress is not dangling, especially for the lining. I don't want the lining to dangle under. After stitching, I marked about 3 cm at the hem of my lining and I cut it off because I didn't want my lining to peep through my dress at the hem. So after cutting it, I made sure that I stitched the areas that I cut through at the side. I folded the hem and I ran a stitch through it. The next thing I did was to use my all-purpose gum to glue the scallop edges to the hem of the dress. I finished up the dress by adding some embellishment or an applique to the bust area. This is the final result on my model. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. In another video, I will show you how to make the second dress. Please like, subscribe and share.